Okay, yeah, so thank you everyone for being here today. I think this is going to be a fantastic weekend of discussions at such a crucial time, and I think the opening session sort of set the tone for both how high the stakes are and the opportunities and challenges that we have ahead of us. Now, September's demonstration led by Tommy Robinson came, I think, as a shock to many. I think even those of us who anticipated that it would be very big were taken aback by the sheer scale of it. We estimate around 200 or so thousand people marched through London in what is probably the biggest far-right mobilization in British history. And that demonstration didn't come out of nowhere. It was a culmination of, in the immediate sense, a summer of protests outside hotels housing asylum seekers, and the Raise the Colours movement, which saw people putting up flags all over the place, which began after the case of an asylum seeker was charged with sexual assault crimes. Which became the spark, I think, of a fast-growing set of protests, both in size and geographical spread across the country. And I think it's worth us sort of taking a step back to look at where this far-right and fascist resurgence has come from, so that we can consider what we need to do about it. And if I can slightly sort of be a bit abstract from the immediate situation, I think the story starts really in 2008 with the financial crisis, which was the beginning of the end of the neoliberal period. This is an economic period of the previous 40 years, which had successfully smashed trade unions and sort of working class institutions of working class struggle, had led to the wholesale privatization of large sections of the economy, the turn away from the welfare state. And internationally, it was a period of globalization, of the spread of capital to every corner of the planet, and the integration of markets and supply chains across continents, the outsourcing of manufacturing to poorer countries, and generally liberalized flows of both commodities and people based on the needs of the market. And I think the 2008 economic crisis saw the contradictions of that neoliberal period come to bear. And in the period since, we've seen the parties of the center struggle to hold on to that system, to bandage the system and keep it afloat. And it has been a period marked by austerity, by the decimation of the public sector and the welfare state, the wholesale shift in employment patterns towards precarious employment, a shift from home ownership to private renting, all of which has contributed to the biggest and most sustained drop in living standards in over a century. And the attempt to stabilize the system and restore profitability for the capitalist class has seen the direct transfer of wealth from the working class and the middle classes to the richest section of the ruling class. And it's in this period that we see the beginnings of a resurgence of the far-right and fascist movements. We see Nigel Farage take center stage on the political scene. We see the old organizers of the fascist BNP, who had been driven to the margins of society by previous anti-fascist struggles in the 90s, start to cohere around the English Defence League and other formations. We see internationally the setting up of groups like the AfD in Germany, Golden Dawn in Greece, the resurgence of Le Pen's Front National in France, and so on. And this was not a one-way shift to the right, but it was a period of political polarization. We see also expressions emerging to the left. We saw Syriza in Greece, Die Linke in Germany, Podemos in Spain, the Front Insoumise in France, Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader of the Labour Party here, Bernie Sanders almost becoming the nominee for the presidential race for the Democrats in the US, and an explosion of social movements against austerity and other social issues. As it has historically done, a flailing ruling class facing challenges from the radical left and the far right will and did choose to attack the left, where the left aims to organize workers in direct confrontation with the profits of the state and of the ruling class, and to varying degrees and in various traditions. Fascist movements sort of capitalize on the resentment and disillusionment with the system and the state, with the failures of parliamentary politics and so on, and even use some anti-capitalist rhetoric, but have never actually threatened the system. Where they have come to power or come close to power, they leave the system and the social relations that come with it intact. And so the left has always posed a bigger challenge to the elite than the right. And corresponding with this period, and not unrelated, we had the chickens of the American-led empire coming home to roost. The overreach of the war on terror marks the beginning of American imperial decline. And what we see is, for 25 years, the West has waged wars, predominantly in the Middle East, as part of its attempt to control its resources, not only to fuel their own economies, but the recent sort of closure of the Strait of Hormuz shows just how central that remains to the global economy, but also to try and limit the fast rising rival of the United States, China, from being able to access those resources. And the inevitable and necessary byproducts of this are the generation of nationalist sentiments, of patriotism towards the West, and Islamophobia to justify the wars against predominantly Muslim people, to explain the resulting backlash of terrorism here in the West, and to demonize dissent, which particularly in Britain came in the form of a coalition between the far left and Muslim communities, and which successfully generated popular opposition to the state. And today we see that Islamophobia is the most dominant form of racism in society. It's a sort of respectable form of racism. And not to say that there is a sort of hierarchy of different types of racism or oppressions, but that racism is systemic and it is driven by the state, and the state's primary target has been Muslims. We see, going back to Tony Blair talking about clash of civilizations. We have Boris Johnson talking about Muslim women being bank robbers and letterboxes. We've seen the continuous narrative around so-called grooming gangs, the demonization of migrants, from Theresa May's hostile environment through to the attacks on small boats and the Rwanda plan and so on. And the majority of these of migrants, or particularly refugees, come from Muslim countries that have been under attack by Western imperialism. And we can see this direct conveyor belt of how the state operates with its rhetoric and with its policies, then driving fascist organization on the streets. In 2014, David Cameron spoke in Parliament at the dispatch box and called Islamic societies and universities hotbeds of extremism. Within a few weeks, the English Defence League had organized attacks on Islamic societies across the country. We saw Michael Gove publicize this totally debunked claim, the sort of Trojan horse affair, which led to attacks against Muslims in Birmingham. We've seen, as I was saying, about the sort of narrative around grooming gangs, the capitalization by people like Tommy Robinson in places like Rochdale and so on. And more recently and more obviously, we've seen the attacks on the Palestine movement, from calling us hate marches and terrorist sympathizers. On the 11th of November 2023, it was Suella Braverman who directly called upon fascists to mobilize on the streets in opposition to our movement. And I think there is a direct line to be drawn from that day, from the 11th of November, through to the riots that we saw starting from Southport in 2024, the Ballymena riots, to the protests outside hotels last year. And those hotel protests, I think it's interesting to note, compared to the riots of 2024, were led by fascists. They were led predominantly by groups like the Homeland Party, which was a split from the Patriotic Alliance, from groups like UKIP and Britain First, which included a number of former members of the BNP. But these protests were supported in the mainstream by Reform, by the Tory party. They were given sympathetic coverage in the news. The BBC ran whole articles quoting Reform candidates at length about why people are concerned. And they gave these ideas and this organization a sense of respectability and helped to grow a periphery around the fascists. But inevitably, the confidence and momentum of fascist organization led to, and has led to, an exponential increase in Islamophobic hate crimes. We've seen in the last year alone, at least 30 mosques have been attacked, including some being set on fire. One in Belfast had a bomb thrown through its window, which the BBC reported as an explosive device. We've seen, Muslims being stabbed in the street. We've seen last year 2 Sikh women in the West Midlands were raped in directly racially motivated attack. And just last month, there was a woman in southeast London who was deliberately rammed over with a car, which the police still have no leads on. And the situation we have today is that you have Tommy Robinson's movement and groupings of fascists, which are driven by the racism and militarism of the state, and which is directly geared against the Palestine movement. We saw that in September, on Tommy Robinson's demonstration, on the stage that he was speaking on, a Palestine flag was ripped up. We've seen the proliferation of Zionists on their demonstrations. We've seen, the upcoming demonstration on 16th of May is called Unite the Kingdom, Unite the West. And we've seen this unholy alliance in local areas between fascists, Zionists, and Iranian monarchists who have been attacking physically and violently left-wing, trade union, anti-war and anti-racist meetings and protests. We also have, at the moment, Reform is still the highest polling party in the country, and which is absorbing more and more of the traditional right. It is adopting policies like scrapping indefinite leave to remain for migrants and stuff, which used to be 10 years ago the kind of thing that only fascists would talk about. And I think it's important to note, because some people have talked about the sort of divisions there are between Reform and Restore and Alliance, and Tommy Robinson doesn't like UKIP and UKIP don't like Britain First and whatever. But I think that lack of coherency within the fascist movement has meant that as a whole it is not stronger than the sum of its parts. But those parts, those component parts, are getting stronger and more coherent, and particularly the sort of 3 essential components, I think, for fascist success, which is a growing and more confident fascist street movement, electoral representation, and support from sections of the ruling class. We know Reform, for example, has got 75% of its total funding in the last 10 years, and I mean the Brexit party before Reform as well, from just 3 billionaires. We've seen wholesale defections from the Tory party into Reform, and we see Exhibit A with the 16th of May, where the Metropolitan Police has allowed Tommy Robinson to claim the entire centre of London, knowing full well that the Palestine movement was planning to demonstrate on that day and had applied for a route on that day, that this can be seen in no other way than the state attempting to use fascists to break the Palestine movement, a Palestine movement which has been a thorn in its side for so long. And so I think the sort of sit back and let them tear themselves apart approach has not and will not work. So how do we turn the tide? And I think I want to start with, I think the Together demonstration a couple of weeks ago was a huge step forward. It was called by a coalition of hundreds of civil society organizations, and it brought 500,000 people onto the streets. And I think the nature of how that demonstration was called and how it came about explains the difference between why we had 500,000 people on the 28th of March and only 30,000 at the counter-protest against Tommy Robinson's demo in September. It's something that we need to continue to develop. We need a united front of organizations that are willing to stand up against the far right. And I think there have been some suggestions that that was a sort of one-off demonstration by Together, which I think are completely mad, and I think it's something that we need to fight to keep in place. It's something that we need to fight to deepen the roots of across the country and to keep mobilizing, particularly on the 16th of May. And I think for us as socialists within that movement, we should be arguing that there needs to be a stronger political coherency to that demonstration and that movement. I think, we need to be far more oriented around combating Islamophobia rather than a sort of general liberal anti-racism. And I think we need to understand that it is part of a strategy of mobilizing the biggest numbers in order to outnumber the fascists, to weaken their resolve, to break their momentum, and to rebuild the confidence on our side. The impact of fascists demonstrating in huge numbers, the impacts of violence in communities demoralizes people, makes people scared. And I think, us having big mobilizations against that is is an antidote to that. And I think in terms of having a broad mass mobilization that is capable of doing this, I think the question of Palestine and imperialism is central. It was notable that on the 28th of March, the vast majority of the people on that demonstration were wearing a keffiyeh or wearing a Palestine badge. Were people who have probably been on a Palestine demonstration, which, the Palestine movement of the last 2.5 years has been probably the biggest, most sustained political movement in this country's history. And it is a movement which is facing the sharp end of state authoritarianism. And so I think it is important in terms of getting the numbers out in the confrontation with the far right, but it is also important in its own right in challenging the imperialism and the Islamophobia of the state, which fuels the fascists. I think I'm on time. But I think as well as the broad mobilizations, we do need specifically anti-fascist organization that is willing to confront and stop the fascists from marching. This year marks the 90th anniversary of the Battle of Cable Street, where a coalition of Jewish people, of the left, of local working class people in East London successfully stopped Oswald Mosley's fascists from marching and successfully stopped the police who tried to enable them marching. And that was a decisive moment in why Oswald Mosley's movement didn't take hold in the way it did in other parts of Europe. And I think in terms of that anti-fascist movement, what it can help to do is to isolate and expose the fascists who are at the core of a much larger movement with a wider layer of sympathy and support. When you see 200,000 people marching on the streets, we know they are led by fascists. We see people Sieg Heiling on the streets. We see Tommy Robinson on the stage. But a lot of the people on those demonstrations will not be fascists, and it should be our job to separate those people, to stop the fascists from being able to recruit more, and to understand that there is contradictory consciousness in society. We know from polls that a vast majority of the British public oppose the genocide in Palestine, are sympathetic to opposing militarism and the rest of it. But at the same time, a vast majority of the population are concerned about immigration and think that we should be closing our borders and are worried about small boats and the rest of it. So I think our position has to be one that tries to drive a wedge between the fascists and the sort of softer periphery around them. I think part of that means we cannot adopt the sort of liberal purity politics approach that has meant we don't engage with people if they hold problematic views, but that we have to try and win people through struggle. And I think some of this can be done through electoral campaigns. We saw, for example, in Caerphilly and Gorton, some of the possibilities of this. And I think it's an utter shame that your party has chosen to attack socialists rather than being a vehicle for the radical left to try and popularize a socialist program that can undercut some of the things that the fascists are talking about. But I think far more importantly and necessarily, we need the mass campaigns, both in terms of confronting the far right and breaking their confidence, but more so to actually engage working class people in struggle over questions of housing, over questions of austerity, over questions of welfare, and which connects to questions of imperialism. And, we were talking about sort of the stealth bringing in of conscription and so on.
And I think we need far more militant and political trade unions that take on the struggle. So I think the tasks that we have to turn the tide are huge, and the stakes couldn't be higher, but I think we are capable of doing it. And I think the Together demonstration was an example of that. I think the examples twice last year when fascists were planning to march through Tower Hamlets, and a coalition of the community led by Muslims, led by anti-racists on the left, managed to successfully stop them from being able to do that, shows that we can do that. And I think in the coming weeks, we need to launch a massive campaign to try and push the police back on their plans for the 16th of May. And part of that means telling everyone around the country, every anti-racist, every trade unionist, everyone, that we need to flood the streets of London on the 16th of May with those of us who stand with Palestine and oppose the fascists. Thank you.